My granddaughter called me at 6:10 on a Tuesday morning in late October, and the first thing she said wasn't hello. "Grandpa, whatever you do, don't wear your red plaid jacket today. Please, just trust me on this." I was already half awake. At 76, sleep, and I have an uneasy agreement, it comes when it wants and leaves before I'm ready. I'd been lying there listening to the wind coming off the lake, the same wind that had rattled these windows every autumn for 31 years. "Emily," I said, sitting up slowly, "it's barely past 6. What's going on?" "I can't explain right now." Her voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard since she was 8 years old and broke a neighbor's window with a baseball. "Just please, leave the jacket at home today. Wear your old barn coat or something. And if anyone calls you before I do, don't answer." "Emily." "Please, Grandpa. I'll explain everything soon. I love you." She hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the phone in my hand. Outside, the first gray light of morning was just starting to show over the water. Lake Ontario doesn't look gentle in October. It looks like it's keeping secrets. My granddaughter is not a dramatic person. She's 18 years old, finishing her first year at Queen's University in Kingston, and she is, in many ways, the most level-headed person in our family. She gets that from her grandmother, my Agnes, who passed 4 years ago and left a silence in this house that I still walk around carefully, the way you walk around furniture in the dark. If Emily was scared enough to call me before sunrise, something was badly wrong. I walked to the closet and looked at the jacket. It had hung on the same hook for 3 decades. A red and black buffalo plaid Mackinaw coat, the kind they've been making in northern Ontario since before I was born. Heavy wool, built to last a lifetime, and this one very nearly had. Agnes gave it to me the Christmas before Robert was born, 38 years ago, back when we were young enough to think a good coat was a luxury. On the left lapel was a small pin, the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters crest, silver and green, that I'd worn since 1987. That pin was the only one of its kind I'd ever seen on that style of jacket. Agnes had found it at an antique market in Belleville and sewn it on herself. "So I can always pick you out of a crowd," she'd said. I left the jacket where it was and pulled on my old barn coat instead. It felt wrong, the way anything unfamiliar feels on a body that's gotten used to its routines. I made coffee, watched the lake through the kitchen window, and tried to understand what my granddaughter could possibly be warning me about. By 8:30, I'd done my usual walk of the property, checked the dock for any storm damage, and made a second cup of coffee I didn't really want. The MacGregor property sits on 40 acres outside Picton, in Prince Edward County. My grandfather bought it in 1951 for reasons I never fully understood. He was a man of instinct, not explanation, and it has been in our family ever since. The main house faces the lake. Behind it there are 2 outbuildings, an old orchard that still produces apples nobody picks anymore, and a stretch of mixed forest that runs to the road. The county assessor valued it last spring at just over $2 million. I don't think of it in those terms. I think of it as the place where my children learn to swim and my wife is buried under the old oak at the edge of the orchard. At 9 o'clock, I drove into Picton to pick up a prescription at the pharmacy and stop for coffee at the Tim Hortons on Main Street, the same Tuesday errand I'd been running for years. The drive takes 12 minutes. I've made it so many times I barely think about it anymore. I thought about it this time. Something about Emily's voice. When I turned onto the main street, I knew immediately that something was wrong. 2 Ontario Provincial Police cruisers were parked outside the marina at the far end of the block, their lights on. A third was pulling in as I watched. Yellow scene tape stretched across the marina entrance, and a small crowd of early morning people had gathered on the sidewalk, the kind of cluster that appears in a small town within minutes of anything unusual, because in a small town, unusual is still news. I pulled over and sat in the truck for a moment. My heart had started doing something I didn't like. I got out and walked toward the tape. I saw her before I reached the police line. My granddaughter was sitting on the back bumper of one of the OPP cruisers, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, her dark hair loose and her face red from crying. An officer was crouched beside her, saying something quietly. The sight of her there, small, wrapped in that crinkly silver sheet like she'd been rescued from something, sent a cold wave through me that had nothing to do with the October wind off the lake. "That's my granddaughter," I told the officer at the tape. He looked at me for a moment, then lifted the tape without a word. A tall woman in plain clothes met me halfway. She had the careful, measuring look of someone who asks questions for a living. "Mr. MacGregor," she said, "I'm Detective Lena Bousquet, OPP. We called your granddaughter about 90 minutes ago. We found her number in the call history of the victim's phone." Victim. The word landed like a stone in still water. "What happened?" I asked. "A man was found near the fuel dock at approximately 5 this morning by the marina operator. Time of death estimated around midnight. We've been trying to identify him." She paused, watching my face the way people do when they're measuring a reaction. "There's something I need to show you, Mr. MacGregor. Your granddaughter said you'd understand when you saw it." She led me past the tape, past the cluster of officers photographing and measuring, to where a second detective was crouching near the dock's edge. He stood as we approached and held up a clear evidence bag. Inside it was a red and black buffalo plaid Mackinaw coat. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at it. The silver and green OFA pin was on the left lapel. "That's my jacket," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. "That's identical to my jacket, down to that pin. That's what your granddaughter said." Detective Bousquet's voice was careful, neutral. She called us at 5:45 this morning after she'd been here for almost an hour. She'd driven down from Kingston last night because she was worried about something she'd seen. When she saw the jacket, she knew. The detective paused. "She also warned you not to wear yours today." I turned to look at Emily. She was watching me now, her face tight with something between grief and relief. "Can I talk to her?" I asked. "In a few minutes. First, Mr. MacGregor, I have to ask, where were you between 10 last night and 2 this morning?" I understood what she was really asking. A man was dead. He was found near a jacket that looked exactly like mine, complete with a pin I'd always thought was unique. Someone had wanted it to look like I was involved. At home? Alone. I went to bed around 10:30. Detective Bousquet nodded slowly. "We'll need to verify that." And we found something else. She held up a second evidence bag. Inside was a document, folded papers, creased and still legible through the plastic. This was in the inside pocket of the jacket. "It's a land transfer document. Your name and property address. Transferring the MacGregor property in Prince Edward County to your son, Robert MacGregor, and his wife, Sandra Reeves MacGregor, for $1. The morning seemed to tilt slightly. "I never signed that. The signature looks authentic. It's notarized." She watched me carefully. "The transfer date is 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks ago. And then I remembered. Sunday dinner at the house. My daughter-in-law had arrived early and spread papers across the dining table before we'd even finished eating. "Insurance renewal," she'd said, waving her hand in that way she had dismissive, as if the paperwork was beneath both of us, but necessary. "Just here and here, Harold. The lawyer says it's routine. Updates your coverage and adds Robert as a named beneficiary on the property policy. Standard stuff, really." She'd slid the pen across the table with a bright smile, and I'd signed without my glasses on, because she was the mother of my grandchildren, and I had trusted her for 17 years. I felt sick. I went to Emily. She stood up when she saw me coming, and I put my arms around her and held on. She was shaking. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," she said into my shoulder. "I didn't know it would go this far. I swear I didn't know." "Tell me everything," I said. She pulled back and wiped her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. "His name was Craig Dempster. He was a private investigator. He called me 2 weeks ago. He'd found my number through public records from Mom's estate," he said. "Some connection to our family. He'd been investigating a series of property fraud cases across Ontario, and he'd found our name in the documents." She took a breath. "He thought he was close to having enough evidence to take to the RCMP. He said he had documents, recorded calls, bank transfer records. He wanted to know if Grandma Agnes had ever signed anything unusual in the last year of her life." Her voice broke. I told him I'd help him. We'd been messaging back and forth. Then last night his messages just stopped. I drove down here and she stopped. His car was in the marina lot. And then I saw the jacket. The jacket that looked like mine. Left beside a dead man in the dark. The plan was clear enough once you saw it whole. Kill the investigator who was getting too close. Dress the scene with my jacket or a convincing copy to create reasonable suspicion around me. And with the forged property transfer already on file, if I was suddenly facing a criminal investigation, who would manage my affairs? Who held the power of attorney she'd been quietly assembling for months? I drove home. My daughter-in-law's white Volvo was parked in my driveway. I sat in the truck looking at it for a long moment before I got out. The lights were on in the study. Through the window I could see movement. I found her at my filing cabinet. The bottom drawer was open, and she had a manila folder on the desk beside her, and she was working through it with the focused efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. "What are you doing in my house?" I said. She spun around. For just a fraction of a second I saw something cross her face, not guilt, but calculation, the split-second recalibration of someone who'd been caught doing something they'd planned carefully. Then the warm smile came back, the one I'd sat across from at 17 years of Christmas dinners. "Harold, thank goodness. Robert heard there was some sort of incident at the marina this morning. We've been worried sick. I came to find your insurance documents, your property records, anything that might help you with whatever's going on." "I never told Robert anything was going on," I said. "And I certainly didn't tell you to go through my files." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere cold, behind all that warmth. "We're family. When family has problems, family helps. Sandra." I stepped into the room, close enough that she couldn't easily move toward the door. "Did you manipulate me into signing a property transfer document 3 weeks ago? I have no idea what you're—" "The document that transfers my property to you and Robert for $1. The one that was found this morning on a dead man." I watched her face, sewn into the pocket of a jacket made to look like mine. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted. "Sit down, Harold," she said, and her voice had changed, thinner, harder. "We should talk about this calmly, because you're clearly very distressed, and distressed people say things they regret." "I'm not distressed," I said. "I'm extremely clear-headed. That's not what your doctor's file suggests." She tilted her head slightly. "Missed appointments. Minor confusion on intake forms. A neighbor who mentioned you'd left your truck running in the driveway twice last month." She paused. "These things add up, Harold, especially when a concerned family member brings them to the attention of a physician." The sound of a car in the driveway cut through whatever I was about to say. Through the study window I watched a dark BMW park beside her Volvo. A man in a charcoal suit got out carrying a leather briefcase. He walked toward the door with the unhurried confidence of someone who charged $400 an hour and knew it. His name was Garrett Fowle, and he walked into my study like he'd been in it before. He set the briefcase on my desk, the one my father built, and opened it without being invited to do so. "Mr. MacGregor, I'm legal counsel for Sandra Reeves MacGregor. Given this morning's unfortunate events and some concerns that have been building for some time, my client has instructed me to file for a capacity assessment under the Substitute Decisions Act of Ontario." He said it the way a pharmacist reads a dosage: efficient, impersonal. "We believe you're experiencing cognitive changes that have affected your ability to manage your own affairs. The court will appoint a guardian if the assessment confirms what the medical record suggests." "What medical record?" I said. "I've never been diagnosed with anything." "Not formally, no. But the pattern of behavior." He removed a sheaf of papers from the briefcase. "Combined with the highly concerning decision you made 3 weeks ago to transfer a $2 million property for $1, which would suggest impaired judgment." "I didn't make that decision. I was deceived into signing a document I wasn't allowed to read." Fowle smiled patiently, the way people smile at children who say something embarrassing. "That's precisely the kind of statement that will support our application. A man of sound mind doesn't sign major property documents without reading them." My son arrived just as the lawyer finished speaking. He stood in the doorway of his childhood home, looking between his wife and me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager, caught between two things he didn't know how to reconcile. "Dad, what's happening?" "Sandra said there was an incident at the marina. Your wife was going through my private files when I arrived home," I said. "She was trying to help. She forged my signature on a property transfer document, Robert. Our home, this property, for $1. I watched my son's face. "And a man was found dead this morning, a private investigator who had been looking into similar property frauds across Ontario. The police found a jacket made to look like mine on his body. Whoever killed him wanted the evidence to point at me." Robert went very still. "Robert," Sandra said, her voice sharp and quiet. "We discussed this, And that was when I knew. My son wasn't the architect of this, but he knew. He had known something. He'd let himself be convinced by her lawyer, by whatever version of events she'd sold him that his father was declining, that protecting the property was protecting the family, that what they were doing was reasonable. He had sat in his wife's narrative long enough that he'd lost the thread of what was real. Fowl was speaking again, laying out timelines and legal remedies, referencing capacity thresholds and guardian appointments, delivering it all in that smooth, measured voice. Sandra stood beside him with her arms folded, watching me the way people watch a situation they believe they've already won. My phone buzzed. A text from Emily. 4 words. Old boat shed. Tonight. And then, below it, 2 more words that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent summers on this property with me since she could walk. Pickerel season. Pickerel season. The emergency code we'd made up together when she was 11, after she'd read a mystery novel and decided we needed a system. She'd only ever used it once before, when a car full of strangers had parked outside the property and she was home alone. She was in real danger. "Excuse me," I said to the room. "I need some air." Fowl spoke about 48-hour response windows as I left the study. I let him talk. The old boat shed sits at the back of the property, where the orchard meets the forest. My grandfather built it before the main house, using timber he'd cut himself, and it has been slowly returning to the forest ever since. The roof holds in dry weather. The floor is packed earth. In fishing season, it smells like lake water and old canvas. In October, it smells like cold and leaf mold and the particular silence of things that have been left alone. Emily was already there when I arrived at 11:30, picking my way through the orchard with a flashlight pointed at the ground. She had her laptop open on an old sawhorse, its light the only brightness in the shed. She looked up when she heard my footsteps. "I was afraid you wouldn't come." "I always come," I said. I sat on the old canoe stand beside her. "Tell me what you found." She turned the laptop toward me. Craig Dempster, the man found at the marina, had been working alone. But before he died, he'd emailed everything he had to a secure server, with a time release instruction if he didn't log in to cancel it within 48 hours. The files would be sent automatically to a contact list that included 3 journalists and a detective at the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit in Ottawa. He'd told Emily about the system 2 days before he died. She'd driven to Picton not only because she was worried, but because she'd known the clock was running. The files were substantial. Sandra had been doing this for 9 years. The pattern was methodical. Identify elderly property owners with significant land holdings. Build trust through family or business relationships. Assist with what appeared to be routine legal paperwork, and execute forged transfers while establishing concurrent paper trails, suggesting cognitive decline in the victim. The properties were transferred to numbered companies she controlled through layers of incorporation. She'd used 5 different lawyers in 3 provinces. Craig Dempster had identified 14 cases across Ontario, 2 in Quebec and 1 in New Brunswick. 11 of the original owners had died within 18 months of signing. Heart conditions, accidents, 1 house fire ruled accidental by a coroner whose name appeared in the payment records. My Agnes had signed something, 14 months before she passed. I looked at the document on the screen and recognized her handwriting shaky by then, not what it had been on a form that should have been witnessed by a solicitor, but hadn't been. It was notarized by a commissioner whose license number cross-referenced with 3 other fraudulent transfers in the file. I didn't say anything for a while. The wind moved in the trees above the shed roof. Somewhere out on the lake, a boat's running light moved slowly in the dark. "How deep does it go?" I asked finally. Emily hesitated. Dempster found payments to a municipal planning official in Hastings County, and one name that keeps appearing in the transaction records a man named Mitchell Farrow. He's listed as a consultant on 6 of the transfers. She looked at me. "He's a licensed paralegal. His office is in Belleville." "Is he the one who notarized my documents, the ones I signed 3 weeks ago?" "Yes." I looked at the files for a long time. Then I looked at my granddaughter. "You were smart to build a dead man's switch," I said. Dempster was. He told me he'd been warned off once before. Someone had broken into his office. She paused. "Grandpa, I think whoever did this is going to realize the files are going out tomorrow morning. When they do," we both heard it at the same moment. Engines on the gravel lane behind the orchard. More than one vehicle, moving slowly, without headlights. Emily closed the laptop. In the sudden dark, the only light came from the thin strip of moon through the shed's single window. "They followed you," she whispered. "Or they followed you," I said. Footsteps in the orchard. The crunch of fallen apples. A flashlight beam swept across the shed wall from outside, and then another, moving together in the organized pattern of people who had done this kind of thing before. "Harold." Sandra's voice came through the old plank walls, clear and almost conversational. "I know you're in there. I could see your flashlight from the road." Emily's hand found mine in the dark. I could feel her pulse in her fingers, fast and light as a bird's. "There's no reason to make this difficult." Sandra's voice was closer now, just outside the door. "Emily, you're an intelligent girl. I've always thought that. Whatever your grandfather has told you tonight, you should understand that this is a legal matter. We have every right to protect family assets from poor decisions." The shed door opened. Sandra stepped in first, and the men with her, 2 of them, neither in uniform, fanned out to either side in the way of people who'd rehearsed the motion. Behind them, half visible in the orchard darkness, I could see a third shape waiting by the trees. Mitchell Farrow, the paralegal, his hands in his coat pockets, his face turned away from whatever was about to happen. Sandra looked at me across the dark shed with an expression I'd never seen on her face in 17 years of family dinners. There was no warmth in it. There had never been warmth in it. I understood now that everything I'd thought I'd known about her had been a performance of extraordinary patience, maintained across nearly 2 decades for the sake of a 40-acre property and whatever it was worth. "You don't have to do anything dramatic," she said. "This can be very simple. Your granddaughter goes back to Kingston tonight. You agree to the capacity assessment, and everyone moves on." "You had a man killed," I said. She didn't flinch. "Craig Dempster was interfering in private legal matters and making slanderous accusations. Whatever happened to him was what?" I said. "An accident? Like Martha Greenberg in Napanee? Like the man in Brockville whose fireplace malfunctioned while he was alone in the house in February?" Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt. More like the look of someone who had just recalibrated how much I actually knew. "You've been busy," she said. 9 years, I said. 14 properties that we know about. 11 people dead. My wife signed something in this room, Sandra, in this house, while I was in the hospital for my knee and she was here alone and you came by to help her. I felt something solidify in my chest as I said it. "You are going to spend the rest of your life in a federal correctional facility. The only question right now is how many people go with you." She looked at me for a long moment with those flat, measuring eyes. Then she looked at the men on either side of her, and something passed between them, a micro-signal, barely visible. "Nobody's going anywhere tonight," she said quietly. "And nobody's going to hear this conversation except the 4 of us." 6, I said. I held up my left wrist. The Apple Watch face glowed faintly in the darkness. "The recording started when you walked through that door. The OPP duty officer in Picton has been listening on a call my granddaughter connected 20 minutes ago. And Dempster's files go out to the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit in Ottawa at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, regardless of what happens to either of us tonight." The shed went absolutely silent. Sandra stared at the watch. Then at me. Then at the watch again, the way people stare at something that refuses to resolve into a form they can manage. "You're bluffing," she said. But her voice had lost its shape. "My granddaughter is 19 years old and she set this up," I said. "Give her some credit." The sirens started maybe 30 seconds later. Blue and red lights swept through the old window in waves, painting the rough walls of the shed in colors that had no business being there, in a place built by my grandfather's hands for storing canoes and fishing gear and the quiet equipment of ordinary life. Detective Bousquet's voice came through the door. "Ontario Provincial Police, come out with your hands visible. This building is surrounded." Sandra didn't move for a long moment. She stood absolutely still in the middle of the old shed, in the light and the noise, and for just a second I saw something cross her face that might have been the recognition of how far she'd come from wherever she'd started. Then one of the men beside her raised his hands, and the other followed, and it was over. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The RCMP Financial Crimes Unit was in Picton by Thursday. By the following Monday, Agents from the same unit had executed search warrants on 3 offices in Belleville and 1 in Ottawa. The numbered companies Sandra had used to receive property transfers began unraveling the way these things do once someone starts pulling threads, names connected to names, accounts connected to accounts, and underneath all of it, a network of small transactions and careful legal language that had taken 9 years to assemble and was now going to take far less than that to dismantle. Mitchell Farrow, the paralegal, cooperated within 48 hours. His testimony placed Sandra at the center of every decision. The 2 men from the shed turned out to have previous convictions in 2 provinces. The planning official from Hastings County resigned on a Tuesday and was arrested on a Thursday. Robert moved out of their house before the week was out. I don't think he'd understood the full picture before that night, I believe that, honestly. Because I know my son, and what I saw in his face when I laid it out was not the expression of a man whose scheme had failed. It was the expression of a man realizing he'd been used. That's a different kind of pain. He came back to the property and moved into the old guest room and didn't talk much for the first week, which was fine. Some things need to be sat with before they can be spoken. We started having coffee together in the mornings. That was enough for a while. Emily drove back to Kingston to finish her semester but called every other day. She'd changed her major to law. She said Craig Dempster's file system had convinced her that the details mattered, that the paperwork was where everything actually lived or died. She was right about that. The 14 families who'd lost property and in many cases lost people began hearing from the RCMP in the weeks that followed. Some of them called me. I didn't know what to say to most of them. There's no language that's adequate for telling someone that a death they thought was accidental was not. I said I was sorry. I said that Dempster had done the work that made it possible to know the truth, and that he'd known the risk and done it anyway. That seemed like the right thing to say about him. A memorial bursary was established in his name at the criminology program at Carleton University in Ottawa. His daughter, 12 years old, living with her mother in Canada, would be eligible to attend on a scholarship if she chose to go. I contributed to the fund. It felt inadequate. Most right things do. Sandra received a federal sentence of 23 years. Fowle, the lawyer, lost his license and received 8. The others received varying terms. The CBC ran the story for 3 weeks. I declined all interview requests except one, a local radio segment in Belleville where I said that the lesson wasn't complicated. If someone tells you that paperwork is routine, read it anyway. If someone you love tells you to be careful, trust them, even when they can't explain why. And if anyone ever tells you that your age makes you easy to manage, that your years of experience are a vulnerability rather than a strength, they are wrong about you in ways they will eventually regret. I started wearing the old Mackinac jacket again in November, when the first real cold came off the lake. The jacket that was found at the marina was held as evidence for months, and I never saw it again. But mine had been here the whole time, hanging on the same hook. The OFAH pin was still on the lapel, still the only one I'd ever seen on that style of coat. Agnes had put it there so she could pick me out of a crowd. I thought about that more than once, in the quiet months that followed. The idea that someone who loved you could find you anywhere because they knew exactly what made you distinct. And the idea that someone who wanted to harm you could try to use that same distinctiveness against you to make your most recognizable quality into evidence of something you hadn't done. They couldn't, in the end, because the people who knew me best were smarter than the people who wanted to use me. That's not luck. That's what family is supposed to be. The following spring, Robert and I rebuilt the dock together. It needed new decking boards and one of the support posts had shifted over the winter, the way things do when the ice comes in hard. We worked most of a Saturday on it, not talking much, just doing the work. In the afternoon, Emily drove up from Kingston and sat at the end of the dock with her feet over the water, eating an apple from the old orchard, watching us work. "I've been thinking," she said, when we'd come to a stopping point, and were sitting on the dock in the April sun, drinking the coffee she'd brought from Tim Hortons in town. "About what?" I asked. "About how you always say Grandma gave you that jacket so she could find you in a crowd." She looked out at the water. I think she was right. I looked at my son and my granddaughter in the spring light on a dock that had stood through 30 winters and one that had nearly been the last. "She usually was," I said. The lake was quiet. The trees on the far shore were just starting to green. Somewhere back in the orchard, a red-winged blackbird was making its case to the morning, loud and certain, and entirely unconcerned with anything except the fact of being here and being heard and intending to stay. I understood that exactly. If any of this sounds familiar, if you're watching this and thinking about your own family situation, about paperwork you've signed without reading, about people who've made you feel like your years make you a problem to be managed, I want you to hear this clearly. Your experience is not a liability. The people who spent your lifetime learning to love you are your greatest protection. Trust them when they warn you, even when they can't explain why. Read everything before you sign. And never, for a single moment, let anyone convince you that you are easy. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. We look out for each other here.